This comes from the Faber and Faber publication, True Ghost Stories of Our Own Time, compiled and edited by Vivian Ray Ellis. Commercial premises. One of the most unexpected discoveries I made when researching this book was that shops, offices and factories are just as likely as historic houses to be haunted by peculiar noises and by the presence of unregistered staff who appear and vanish at will, paying no regard to the boss or his precious work schedules. R. H. Hodkinson from Manchester was appointed security officer at Salford University in 1964 and embarked on what was to prove a perplexing and worrying period in his life. A brand new warehouse was built in Salford by the German firm of Bayer & Co. just before the First World War. It became quite famous as the Manchester Warehouse, or W22, as it was known by the staff of the giant chemist firm Boots, who acquired it in two parts, the office section in Paris Street and the warehouse section in Cannon Street. It was never occupied by Bayer & Co., as there was at the time a strong anti-German feeling in that area, the people of Manchester and Salford being convinced that the Germans used their building as a front to conceal German gun emplacements intended for the shelling of Liverpool. Whatever the gossip, the building, completed in 1915, remained empty until Boots purchased it. Then another wing fronting on Adelphi Street was added to it, converting the whole building into a huge oblong, with a motor garage making up the fourth side. By 1927, the immense and much admired concrete structure housed hundreds of employees who, to the envy of their colleagues in other Boots branches, enjoyed the latest innovations in office and warehouse fixtures and fittings, including the use of a spacious kitchen and canteen capable of seating 200 diners. As Boots did not require all the space available, the district manager and clerical staff of HM Post Office telephones occupied the frontage in Paris Street at this time. In 1962, the building was empty, and the following year the Royal College of Advanced Technology took it over as an annex. When the college was replaced by the University of Salford in 1964, the building became known as the Adelphi and was used by students. Today the structure remains much as it was in the days of Boots and HM Post Office telephones, with the main entrance unchanged, still used as it was 60-odd years ago. On his first day, Mr. Hodgkinson arrived at 7 a.m. to take over the post from the night duty officer, who reported that all was well before departing and leaving the newcomer to begin his duties. Mr. Hodgkinson made it his practice to begin his patrol at the top of the building, working his way methodically down to the basement, where there was a cubbyhole used by the electricians as a tea room. On one particular occasion, a Sunday morning, he found a book on a table and borrowed it to browse through until lunchtime. Returning with it to his office, he went off to find an electric kettle to make a cup of tea, and on his return, the book, a copy of Lady Chatterley's Lover, had vanished. There was nobody in the building. He had established that on his inspection tour a few minutes earlier, and he was at a loss to account for the disappearance of the book. He checked the security of the building and searched high and low for it, but failed to find it. The officer who relieved him and all the cleaners were subsequently requested to look for it, but the book was never found. A year later, Mr. Hodgkinson was on night duty one Saturday from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. He saw the colleague he relieved leave the building before inspecting the register, which had to be signed by any student given permission by his head of department to work in the building after hours. According to this record, the building was empty, and calling control on his personal radio, he walked out into the foyer. As he did so, he saw a man in a blue suit walk along the corridor and disappear from view. Mr. Hodgkinson heard the intruder open an office door and close it. He gave no sign that he had seen the watchman, and Mr. Hodgkinson was quite baffled. How had he and the previous security officer overlooked him, and why had a door been left unlocked? I went over, turned the door handle to go in, and questioned the man, but the door was locked, and I had to use my pass key to enter, when I found the room empty. I wasn't unduly surprised, merely thinking I had got the wrong office. It must be the next one. But it wasn't, nor the one after that, nor was he in any of the office rooms that lined the corridor. I searched them all, and none had an exit door. When you went in, you had to come out. I whistled up the man on the mobile, and when he arrived, he tooted his horn. I let him in. Together the two men searched the building from roof to basement, but found no one. The following night, after the day officer had reported nothing unusual had occurred, Mr. Hodgkinson decided he would track down the intruder in the blue suit. Changing into gym shoes, he wandered down to the machine shop. It was a big wide room. On the window side, rows of workbenches stretched down to the fire door at the bottom, and dotted about the floor were machines of various shapes and sizes. There was a toilet at the far end, 6 cubicles with wash basins on the opposite wall, and fastened above each of them a paper towel container. He stood quietly for some time, and was about to move off, when he heard footsteps. At first he thought they came from outside the building, but then he realised they were in the corridor. The person he heard stepping along so briskly would have had to use the fire door to reach the floor above Mr. Hodkinson, which was a passage with a wooden floor. As soon as he heard the fire door open and the footsteps, those of a woman, start clickety-clicketing along the wooden floor, Mr. Hodkinson sprinted upstairs and stood outside the exit door. For a few moments the footsteps were loud and clear and purposeful, but then they stopped in mid-stride. Silence fell. He flung open the door to discover there was no one there. Mr. Hodkinson could find no explanation. He toyed with the idea that the building was haunted, that the man in the blue suit had taken the missing book, that he had perhaps once worked in Boots' workshop, that the footsteps were caused by the restless spirit of a woman who had perhaps worked for H.M. Post Office telephones 40 years ago. For some weeks nothing happened. Then, once again on Saturday night duty, Mr. Hodkinson was in the inquiry office on the ground floor at 1 a.m, when he heard a thud on the floor of the classroom above. There was the sound of a heavy object being dragged from one end of the room to the other, footsteps milled around, the sound of chairs being pushed back as people stood up from a table or workbench. The whole room seemed to be alive with bustling activity. And then came the footsteps that I recognised at once. A chair was scraped back, and the quick, light footsteps came across the floor. A door opened and closed, and the footsteps began their march down the corridor, through the fire door, and into the passage where weeks ago I had tried to meet the woman responsible for them. With gym shoes on, I made no sound as I went up the staircase to the floor above. The door of the classroom faced me as I reached the top. I went across to it slowly and quietly, and reached for the door handle. Touching it was like pressing a button. All the noise and that bustling activity stopped instantly, and I went into a silent, empty classroom. Standing there in the silence among rows of school desks, the blackboard with its bits of chalk, I suddenly thought that I was an intruder. I had no business to be there. Conscious of his intrusion, Mr. Hodkinson sensed that the room was crowded with invisible workers of the long-defunct Post Office Telephone's office, impatiently waiting for him to leave the room before they resumed their tasks. Later, Mr. Hodkinson learnt that in the days of Boots' occupancy, the machine shop had been the packing department. In 1927, one of the employees, a morose-looking man, threw down his claw hammer, donned his coat and hat, and for reasons of his own, walked out of the job. 3 days later, his body was recovered by police from the River Irwell, a mere 30 yards from the building. The description of him, given to me in 1979 by his brother, fitted exactly the man in the corridor. It fitted the man who used to go into the toilets in the machine shop in the early hours to have a wash and brush up. I knew that if I went in, I would find nothing. I had tried so many times before. The flushing of the lavatory, the sound of the running tap, the sound of the paper towel as he briskly dried his hands. Perhaps the flush chain would be moving, or a basin would be wet. And what about the paper towel he had used? Would I find it in the bin? No. I never found anything. What I was listening to was of another time. I was listening to the past. Everything that I heard was an echo back in time. As the years passed, I accepted that theory, until, in the year of the miners' strike, 1973, the man in the corridor came to see me. To conserve electricity during the strike, power cuts were introduced, usually about 9 p.m, when most households were settling down for the night. Many districts were blacked out completely, and on another Saturday night when Mr. Hodkinson was on duty, he found himself in total darkness in the building with a torch without a battery and an oil lamp without oil. He radioed to control to explain what had happened, indicating that there was nothing he could do until the lights came on again. He describes what happened then. I found myself in an office just off the corridor that I knew had a chair inside to the right of the door, and there I sat in the blackness and pondered on this and that. This was Saturday night, the night of the week when the likely lads toddled forth to do a spot of wassailing and dally with a wench or two. My mind shuttled off to the club, of which I was a committee member, and then suddenly all thoughts of the club left me, as I stared at a round, bluish ball that had appeared on the opposite wall, about the size of a tennis ball. It hung there, an electric luminous pulsating blue that grew bigger and bigger as I watched it, until it was as big as a large football, when it slowly elongated upwards and downwards, and shaped itself into a kind of oblong picture frame. No, not a frame. I was looking through a window, and the pulsating blue was space. I was looking through a window into space. Sitting in the chair, I was rigid, spellbound, every nerve in my body vibrating like a violin string as I stared at the light. Then in the top left-hand corner of the frame of light, the figure of a man appeared, walking quickly towards me. He came towards the bottom corner, getting bigger the nearer he came, and then finally He simply walked off the frame and was gone. For a few seconds the frame hung in space, pulsating this incredible blue. Then it began to dim and shrink into itself, and then it was gone, and the blackness came back. I don't think I was frightened. As I stared into the darkness of the room, my mind whirled about, trying to assimilate what I had just seen. Somewhere in my mind I could hear a voice saying over and over, "The man in the corridor. He was the man in the corridor." And as I stared, I became aware of him, slowly materializing out of the darkness in front of me. And then I'm afraid I did panic, and I've been sorry about it ever since. I should have stayed instead of groping my way out of the room, desperate to get away. The face I had seen had been a friendly face, the big dark eyes full of kindness. I have thought about him so many times over the years. After that episode, Mr. Hodkinson continued to hear noises in the machine shop for another 2 years, but the man in the blue suit never appeared again. With his letter, Mr. Hodkinson sent me an article about the Manchester warehouse which appeared in Boots and House magazine in 1927, illustrated with photographs taken that year, including several shots of staff working there. "Look at the picture I have enclosed," he writes. "Somewhere among the faces looking out at you is the man in the corridor. Would he be the person who took the book? Was he the man who washed in the toilet at night? And the girl who walked so briskly down the passage to infinity, which one of the girls in the picture is she?" The Adelphi now houses a school of music. There is some doubt about its future. "What will happen to these invisible friends of mine if they pull it down?" asked Mr. Hodkinson. "Will the workforce in the classroom still bustle about in a room reduced to rubble? Will the man wash and brush up in a toilet no longer there?" Lionel Geoffrey Jackal had an odd experience after moving in as first tenant of a second-floor flat in Marketplace, Kendal, in August 1971. Formerly as a butcher's shop with accommodation above it, the property was bought by a well-known building society which converted the upper floors into self-contained flats and used the ground floor as offices. One Tuesday evening in February 1973, Geoffrey Jackal retired at 11:15 p.m. and, following his usual custom, read for half an hour before switching off the light. Perhaps 10 minutes later I was in the pleasant state of limbo between sleeping and waking, when I became conscious of a bluish-grey shadow immediately inside the door. I can only describe it as being shaped like a large inverted dunce's cap. I watched it for possibly half a minute, when it started to move towards my bed with a juddering movement. Strangely, I felt absolutely no sense of fear, although I cannot claim to have particularly strong nerves. The figure continued towards my bed until it was near enough to touch, then vanished. I was just reassuring myself that I had imagined the whole thing when there was a heavy thump on my bed, just as though a heavy person, unable to control his weight, had sat on my bed. I certainly hadn't imagined that. There was an interesting sequel to the story. On the following Friday I was looking through the obituaries in the local paper, when the names Brown, name changed, former owner of the butcher's shop, and Smith, name changed, parents-in-law of Brown, caught my eye. All three had died on the Tuesday night. The Smiths had kept the butcher's shop before Brown, and husband, wife, and son-in-law died within 2 or 3 hours of one another. A photograph of an old building in Birmingham, its brick facade blackened with soot, reminds Cecil P. Howe of Staffordshire, a retired engineering consultant, of an interesting tale. In 1951 he acquired the lease of a building at 16 to 17 Lionel Street, Birmingham, when he bought Rosser & Co., the firm occupying the premises. At that time the building was in a sad state, and badly in need of repair. Rossers undertook factory maintenance work in the region, offering service at weekends and during holiday periods. It was therefore not unusual for Ross's staff to have keys to the premises to enable them to collect material required out of hours. The previous owner of the firm, Mr. Russell, had died shortly before Cecil Howe had bought the premises, and the new owner started using the old man's office. He remembers clearly the layout of the office in Mr. Russell's day, with the old desk and its easy chair, and the old cheque printing machine, which is now kept in Mr. Howe's own home, alongside the original brass door knocker, which used to grace the office section of the building and now announces visitors at the house front door. Late one Saturday night, sometime after Ross's had changed hands, 2 of the firm's fitters called in at 16 to 17 Lionel Street to collect some fittings that were urgently required, and as the key to the gunmetal store was kept in Mr. Russell's office, they ran upstairs to fetch it. Cecil Howe says that this is their account of what happened. On opening the office door, they were both shocked at seeing, as they thought, Mr. Russell asleep, sitting in his usual chair, and in a great hurry they ran away. They knew Mr. Russell had been dead for some time. They would never again go into the office at night. Unable to bring himself to believe the fitter story, Mr. Howe contacted authorities engaged in psychical research in London, but he failed to find any explanation for the incident. There was, however, a fascinating sequel. In 1958, Cecil Howe bought the freehold of the building and demolished it, constructing on-site a new office block, which was officially opened on the 25th of November 1959 by the Lord Mayor of Birmingham, Alderman Lewis. The remaining stock, furniture and office equipment belonging to Mr. Russell's firm was dispersed, but in the new building, Brian Grange, name changed, the secretary of Mr. Howe's new business, Froggatt, Prior Limited, had placed Mr. Russell's comfy old chair in his own office. One day, Brian Grange rang down to the general office requesting papers on file to be delivered to him. Half an hour later, when the delivery boy had failed to appear, he rang again, demanding to know where the papers were. Mr. Howe continues, "The boy then came up to the office with the papers and said that he had been up with them before, but looking through the glass partition, he had seen an old gentleman sitting in the old chair and did not want to go in and interrupt. Brian said that at no time had he had anyone in the office since originally calling for the files, but the boy insisted he had seen someone in the chair. Although quite a newcomer, he gave a description which tallied with the long-dead Mr. Russell." Mr. Howe adds that the haunted chair seems to have disappeared in the various moves and changes made since then, and he hopes old Mr. Russell and his ghost now lie undisturbed.